investment, even in these kinds of dire straits where we're so worried about balancing the budget. Sometimes making a little bit of investment can do us a lot of good in the short term as the long term. And personally, I'm disappointed that while we were able to kind of hold the line, we discontinue the investment in our early childhood allowances. But we're going to be working with the business community and coming back next year, hoping that we can help some more kids, get to that even playing field.
Okay. One more question here, and this is the big ticket question of the day. At what point do we as Minnesotans decide that early childhood education isn't really any different importance and maybe even more important than K-12 education as an investment tool, and decide to make sure that all kids in Minnesota have access to a high quality, strong early foundation in education?
Well, I'd argue that time is now. And based on parents, we don't want to mandate anything. Parents should be getting to decide whether their kids are participating. But we're falling behind states like Arkansas, West Virginia, Oklahoma, states that Minnesotans who believe, we all believe our kids are above average. We don't want to be falling behind. And those states are making sure that kids, if parents want to, are getting a good early learning experience. And I'd argue that it's one of the better form of investment, not just for the future of our state, but if we're serious about putting money back in parents' pockets, it's a much bigger deal for parents of young kids than a tax break to be able to provide some assistance to making sure that their kids are getting a good start. So we need to be working on that now, and I think we need to continue working with businesses and parents and educators together to make it happen.
All right, thank you very much. Senator Clark, thank you for joining us today. We'll be back in just a moment here for some additional information about the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment with former DNR Commissioner and State Senator Gene Merriam. Stay with us. Thanks much.
I'm really sorry.
No, don't worry. Welcome back. We're joined now by somebody whose conservation credentials are pretty much above reproach. We're joined by Gene Merriam, a former DFL state senator who also served as DNR commissioner for 4 years under Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty. Thank you for joining us, Gene.
My pleasure, Ted. Thank you.
Now, going back to November 4th of 2008, the voters of Minnesota very solidly passed a constitutional amendment called the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment that provided an initial 0.3% sales tax increase to fund things like clean water, wildlife habitat, the arts, among others. Now, I know there were a lot of rumors and discussion out there about how that funding was going to be actually allocated in the end. Can you give us a brief breakdown of how the funds are actually going to be spent?
Sure. I think just backing up a second and talking about the big picture, this sales tax increase that started July 1st, it will be generating in the neighborhood of $250 to $300 million additional revenue per year. And it's split into 4 different funds in the new constitutional dedication. There are assigned percentages, but roughly 1/3 of the money goes to the Outdoor Heritage Fund. 1/3 of the money goes to the Clean Water Fund. 1/5 of the money goes to the Parks and Trails Fund. And I'm sorry, 1/5 of the money, I even get confused myself, 1/5 of the money goes to the Arts and Heritage Fund, and 1/7 of the money goes to the Parks and Trail Fund. And if you solve for the lowest common denominator and put all that together, you see that comprises the whole pie, and with those 4 pieces. of the amount that goes into the outdoor, well, that's the basic thing, and the Outdoor Heritage Fund can only be used under the new constitutional provision to fund items that will protect, restore, or enhance prairies, wetlands, forests, and fish, game, and wildlife habitat. It's got to be, for that third coming out of that fund, it's got to meet that criteria. For the Clean Water Fund, generally can be used for protection, restoration, and enhancement of surface water and protection of groundwater from degradation, in a nutshell.
All right. Thank you. Now, a lot was made during the legislative session about what process was actually going to be used to determine the priorities within those pieces. And I know that one piece of it was the SARD Commission that came out of the legislature. Can you describe to us a little bit what discussion took place down at the legislature this year and what process is going to be used now for some of those funds?
Well, in the same legislation that put the question on the ballot, the Lessard Outdoor Heritage Council was created and directed with the responsibility to make recommendations to the legislature. All four of these funds are subject to legislative appropriation, but the one fund, the Outdoor Heritage Fund, has the statutorily created what's now called the Lessard Sams Outdoor Heritage Council. That's pretty much a blue ribbon commission of citizens and legislators. There are actually 4 legislators on that commission, and as well as 8 other citizens. And they make recommendations to the legislature, and the legislature then decides. There was some question as to how closely the legislature was going to follow those scientifically and derived recommendations. And when the smoke cleared and the dust settled at the end of the legislative session, the legislature followed pretty closely, very closely, the recommendations of the council. The major investments this first go-around was of that piece going to the Outdoor Heritage, from the Outdoor Heritage Fund, was for forest conservation easements. And what that means is they put aside $36 million that matched another $9 million of private money over 2 years. That $45 million will be used to buy the development rights so that large blocks of forest land in northern Minnesota will be protected in perpetuity against development. One of the biggest threats to habitat in this state is what's happening in our northern forests. As we're seeing large blocks of forest lands, just like we've seen in other forested regions to the east of us, being sold off by the timber companies and being developed and fractionalized. The fracturing of our forest holdings is a significant threat of concern to hunting groups, angling groups, and birding groups, and environmentalists of all stripes. So there was good consensus among folks that are strongly connected with habitat concerns that it was a wise investment to use a major source at the beginning of this 25-year effort to protect habitat in Minnesota. This was of paramount importance.
Sure, I can understand that. Much of the rationale used to argue in favor of this constitutional amendment was that over time, funding for conservation purposes had been sort of competing as a priority against more seemingly immediate needs like education and healthcare as we went through deficit cycle after deficit cycle. Was that the case? And can you give us some perspective on just how dire the situation was getting for this funding to be put in place?
Well, to give you some, again, big picture perspective, and it wasn't something that happened dramatically or suddenly, but over the course of the previous 3 decades, environmental